Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells, and I write horror, science fiction, and fantasy, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, we're going to talk about the Dungeonmasters Guide, which is obviously the big D&D book. It's one of the core triumvirate books that every D&D player or game master needs: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. And I've talked about both of the other ones. Now we're looking at the Dungeon Master's Guide. I do not have, as always, the PDF for this one, but I do have D&D Beyond. So we're going to look at D&D Beyond right now. So the Dungeon Master's Guide is exactly what it sounds like. It's how to be a Dungeon Master, which in this case means here's a bunch of information that you need to run a game, but that players don't need to play the game. So it's things like dungeon design and random magic item tables and things like that. What it does not include is information on how to be a good what it does not include is information on how to be a good dungeon master, how to run a table, how to wrangle players, how to help guide the story and make things interesting. There might be a couple of paragraphs here and there, but that's not really what this book is designed to cover. A lot of other books from other publishers do cover that. My favorite one is this, The Extreme Dungeon Mastery by Tracy Hickman. We'll be mentioning him multiple times in this review. But anyway, there you go. Speaking of Tracy Hickman, another thing that this book doesn't really get into is how to design a campaign. And I know that it says right here, a world of your own, mapping your campaign, creating a campaign. That's not what I mean, okay? To be fair to this book, I rarely have ever seen a really good book about how to design a campaign. And by that, I'm coming at this from a novelist's perspective. Like I said, I publish horror, science fiction, fantasy. I've got 19 books in print. And so I think about stories in a long-term sense. Let's take a look at what they do have here. The World of Your Own chapter. So this is where we're talking about Tracy Hickman. A couple of years ago, I was on a Comic-Con panel with Tracy Hickman talking about campaign design. And it became very obvious about 10 or 15 minutes into the panel that we were talking about two different things. Half of us were talking about campaign as the story that you're telling, and half of us, including Tracy, were talking about campaign as the world in which you are playing. So whereas I would think of Ravenloft, for example, as this is the story of Ravenloft, this is the series of adventures that are going to tell a story and lead us to a certain point, he was thinking of Ravenloft as the region in which you play, and here's this story about Strahd that takes place within the Ravenloft campaign setting. The reason I mention all of that is that that is more or less the tactic that this Dungeon Master's Guide takes when it's talking about how to design a campaign. It really is about how to design a world in which your player group can explore and have adventures. So it goes through some really interesting things, and it starts with core assumptions, because the basic D&D campaign is heroic fantasy, right? Here's a bunch of people, and we're going to go around, and there's wizards, magic is commonplace, we buy our tools with gold, all of these kind of core D&D assumptions. Here's a bunch of different ones. So for example, what if the world is completely untamed, or it's ancient? What if the world is very magical? And then it goes on, what about some different things that you can change? What if the world is very low magic? What if everything has already been explored? What if, there are lots of gods, or what if there aren't any gods at all? There's lots of different things that you can do as you are creating your own world. And then one of the things I love about Dungeons and Dragons, especially in 5th edition, is that there is no kind of base setting. There's some very brief setting information, such as, spells are named after gods and things like that. But you don't have to play it in Forgotten Realms or Eberron or Dark Sun or whatever. Dark Sun's not even in 5th edition, but as far as I know. Um, so yeah, you get to design your own world if you want to. And so it's starting off, if you're going to design your own campaign setting, then here's a bunch of different options for you. And then it goes through some, how to design a map. And this, again, this is speaking from a world building point of view, not a storytelling point of view. None of this information is going to tell you this is how you design a map that will tell a good story, that will lead your characters in certain directions. It's just, what are the physical mechanics of map design? And if that's what you're looking for, it's awesome. It's actually a very complete system about different scales. It goes through all these things. So, hooray. It talks about languages and dialects. It talks about, more things of... Now, this is where we get into a little bit of the storytelling, okay? Where it says create a campaign. But it's not really about designing a storyline. So you've got, you start small. Here's a little home base. Here's a little home map. We start with a little adventure, and then we just kind of roll out from there. How are you going to get the characters involved? What are their backgrounds? And then you just move on. And so it is good information. I'm just letting you know what kind of information it isn't. Anyway, it does go into specific play styles, which I like, because not everyone is the same. Do you want a hack and slash game, a super storytelling based game, something else? And then different tiers, because Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition scales very well as it goes up. And so, you start as local heroes, and then you hit this Heroes of the Realm level, and so on, moving up until you are the Masters of the World, etc., etc. And it gives information on if you're going to just go ahead and jump right into the, Masters of the Realm level, then here's all the things that you can do. Different kinds of fantasy: heroic, like the baseline, sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, mythic fantasy, dark fantasy, intrigue, mystery, like it just goes on and on. Very complete and very cool stuff. So if you are looking to design a setting, Chapter 1 is a great one. If you're looking to design an actual adventure that your characters can play through, this book has got a little more information, and this is where it starts to become much more storytelling focused. So we'll jump to Chapter 3. Chapter 2 is just more setting information, but getting into the planes. Chapter 3 does have some really great adventure stuff. Now, if you want to do more adventure stuff, you can go to D&D Beyond, and they've got some really good stuff online. In fact, today, let's have a look at this. Let's design an adventure, building on the pillars. They have been doing a series where it talks about the pillars of adventure design, and then this one is, let's take those pillars and put an adventure on top of them. So they're doing some good stuff. They've got a lot of really great adventure design elements that are available. This core book, the Dungeonmaster's Guide, first of all, it kind of says, here's some basic things that you need. If you are a Dungeon Master with absolutely zero background, you're in a play group, your Dungeon Master left, or he's finished, or whatever, and you need to start a group and everyone picked you, you don't know what you're doing? Well, here you go. You can dive right in. It tells you how to use published adventures. It tells you how to begin stuff, how to make your own. And then it has what I always love, these kind of generic tables, and this one can do some interesting things. This one in particular I like a lot, because it's like, what if you're going to do a dungeon adventure, okay, location-based adventure that is going to be in a dungeon? Well, what is your goal? Your goal doesn't have to be kill every single monster and get every single piece of treasure. If that's what your group wants, that's great. But what about rescue someone who's captured in the dungeon? Or my favorite one down here, pursue fleeing foes who have taken refuge in the dungeon. And so there's a lot of neat ideas here for things to do different. And then they got the same thing for wilderness goals, the same thing for other goals. And so there's a lot of good information. And you can actually just roll all of this stuff. Who are the NPCs? Who are your allies? what patrons have put you onto this track, and you can get a good adventure out of it. It even has an introduction and a climax so that you can build everything together and do a really great job. Then it has another section on how to create encounters. It has a section talking about random encounters. I am not a fan of random encounters, but this gives a very good justification for why they might sometimes be really helpful if that's what you're looking for. So, yay them! Let's go back to the table of contents here. It's got a section on designing NPCs, which you just build them like characters. And then it talks more about environments. So kind of those things that we were looking at before, dungeons, wilderness, and urban. It's got really detailed sections here on how to do all of that stuff. What kind of a dungeon is it? Is it just a Moria? You know, every dungeon at some level is just Moria. But it doesn't have to be. It could be something that is in a weird place, or something that is made out of weird stuff, or that has some kind of weird effect going on. It also asks you to consider, well, who made the dungeon? Okay? And how will that change what it's like? Is there some kind of weird group behind it? Were they good or bad? What kind of people were they? Why did they make the dungeon? So that you can break away from that let's just do Moria again kind of mindset. I really like the way that they have this information. They put them in random tables and you can roll or you can choose. They do the same thing for treasure. Let's take a look at the treasure because I do enjoy this a lot. Is this what I want? Treasure tables? So, no, that's not what I want. Ooh. These are just how to roll random treasures, and those are valuable, but what I wanted to show you here is this part further down, right here. So you've found a +1 sword, let's say, and that can be the most generic, boring object in the game. Or, again, the Dungeonmaster's Guide gives you a lot of information. Who created that? You know, was it an air elemental? Well, then the sword is going to be really lightweight. It feels hollow. It's totally different than a sword that was made, say, by a fiend, which looks completely different. So you can define kind of how it looks. You can figure out some of its history. What is the story behind this weapon that you've found? Does it have any other special properties? Does it have any weird quirks? And these are all just ways of turning that +1 sword into something super cool, like, you know, Bilbo found Sting. And literally, I mean, you can read through that, and I know that Tolkien wasn't like rolling stats on a table, but they killed some trolls, they looted their stuff, and he found a +1 sword. That's all that happened, mechanically speaking. But by adding some extra stuff on top, this actually, you know, was an interesting sword with an elven background, and it glows every time orcs are near. These tables give you more options to do that. You can absolutely just make it up on your own, but I will admit that I've been dungeon mastering for decades and usually forget to do all this stuff. And so having the tables is really nice. So good for them. And then, of course, they've got all of these magic tables and how things are laid out. One thing that's interesting about the way 5th edition uses treasure. I love 5th edition. I think it is the best version of Dungeons and Dragons. In part because it is so loose. They have abstracted a lot of things so that you can play it very quickly. It isn't as crunchy and as numbers heavy as 3.5 or 4 were. One of the trade-offs of that is that I feel, having run now big campaign in the system, that money doesn't matter a ton. It doesn't feel like there's any already built-in mechanical pressure to earn or spend money on really anything. And maybe that's just the way I run the game. But the books, I keep reading the books to say, how much money are people supposed to have? What are they supposed to use it for? And so in that sense, treasure isn't as appealing in this edition as I feel like it was in previous editions. It's still really cool, but I almost feel like it is more of a character definition thing. You want to give your characters specific items that they like that can help you telling your story rather than just rolling on the tables. But if you want to roll on tables, you can, and there's like 1,000 of them, and they're excellent. So, hooray for random treasure tables. This also gets into some between adventures stuff. And I like that this section is in here because Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think typically thinks about that. I would say the average player. It's not like The One Ring or Pendragon, where you've got the winter phase where you take care of your house and you have children and things like that. And so we just kind of assume that it's a day by day, hour by hour adventure thing. Well, it doesn't have to be. And so there's a lot of things that you can do in between adventures where you can take the time to jazz up your equipment if that's what you're into, that you can interact with NPCs, you can carry on some kind of life outside of just killing monsters and solving problems and things like that. So it gives some kind of basic and this is where it gets into the overarching story idea, which I had expected to find in the campaign section. It finally brings it up here in the what do we do between adventures section. And it isn't very long, but it does talk about it and how to foreshadow things, how to construct your series of adventures into a long form campaign story, and yay! So it's got some good stuff in here that I like. And then downtime activities. What do you actually do? You can build a stronghold. This could be a reason to encourage them to save up money because they really want to build a castle, and that costs a whole ton of things. Carousing. There's all kinds of other things that you can do between adventures, so that's really neat. And then it's got this running the game section, but again, that is mostly focused on the mechanics. How do the rules work? How do you use the rules? If you want something that is going to tell you how do you deal with that problematic guy at the table, how do you make sure that the adventure is exciting? This is more kind of storytelling rather than mechanical information. Something like XDM is going to be what you're looking for. So last of all, I want to look at this chapter, the Dungeonmasters Workshop, because I think this is where this book really shines. Everything else is core information. Here's how the game works. Here's how you can use it in your particular group. Done. This is the one. This is the chapter that gives you permission, so to speak, and then gives you advice on how to create your own stuff. And so you can see here on this side how to create your own monsters, create your own spells, create your own magic items, even new character options such as different races, different sub-races, different classes, and etc. and etc. Are you going to modify an existing class or create a whole new one out of whole cloth? Back to the beginning of the chapter, it gives just some variants on the rules. There's many variants on the proficiency system. That seems like such a simple part of the game. Your character is better at some skills than others. Well, there's a lot of ways to tweak that. Maybe instead of a flat bonus, you use dice. Maybe instead of having proficiency in skills, you just have them in certain attributes. I really like this personality trait one a lot, to the point that I wish that I had read this chapter before I started my campaign, because I totally would have used it. So, for example, if your personality trait, the one they give in here is, I never have a plan, but I'm great at making things up as I go along. So that means that then you get that special bonus, that proficiency bonus, not based on a specific skill, but when you are improvising, when you are MacGyvering a solution, when you have no plan and you're like, well, it's time to go. And so it encourages people to kind of role play these specific attitudes and personality traits. And I really think that is a really cool, interesting variant on the core system. It also offers hero points, which is nowhere near the level of narrativist gaming that a lot of other systems use. but it's still very interesting. And so there's a lot of stuff you can do. There's honor, there's sanity, there's fear checks and horror checks. There's a lot of extra stuff in here. Ways to make healing a lot slower, ways to make healing a lot faster. A whole section on firearms if you want to include that in your game, whether that is something really simple like Three Musketeers or you want to go full on science fiction. It's got laser pistols and antimatter rifles in here. So there's a lot of neat stuff. The Dungeonmaster's Guide, I don't want it to sound like I'm bagging on it because it's not certain things. What it is a really great reference guide of how to play the game of Dungeons and Dragons, how to be the Dungeon Master. And so all of the information in here is valuable, especially if you are a first-time Dungeon Master, someone who's been doing this for a long time. You could probably fudge a lot of this stuff and get away with it, but that's likely because you read 3 or 4 earlier versions of this exact book. The book itself is super valuable. So I just want to say hooray, and I hope that you like this game. I hope that you take a chance to check out this book, The Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.